Buenos días. Antes de introducirle una cosa en español, castellano, y es que yo estoy tremendamente cansado, pero no por lo que haya trabajado, sino porque esto es abrumador, no es un sin parar. Y la gente que hace esto debe estar absolutamente agotada, porque yo solo de verlos a ellos, y es que me canso. Pues yo en realidad no he hecho nada, pero es abrumador. No sé si tenemos que reducir a quinta, porque vamos en séptima, por lo menos, ¿no? Pero todo muy interesante, claro. Entonces a uno le apetece estar en todas las sesiones y no puede. Bien, esta es la sesión penúltima, porque luego nos clausurarán. Many thanks to Pilar. The president asked to ask me or invite me, I don't know what, to introduce the keynote speaker, who is Edward Norton. Edward Norton studied economics in Princeton and then made his PhD in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has had several jobs, always related to a typical health economist. You are going to see why. Now he's a professor of economics, and he has a lot of publications, and he has publications in Health Economics, Journal of Health Economics, Journal of Mental Health Policy and Economics, Health Services Research, Value in Health, Journal of the American Medical Association, Economics and Human Biology, Social Science and Medicine. Is typical health economist. But it's very interesting because he's a typical health economist with lot of research interest in long-term care and aging, econometrics. I like very much that he has 2 papers in the Stata Journal, because this means that his generosity to give programs to other researchers in order to be used without programming. So it's very interesting, this kind of behavior. Dr. Norton has led several studies of the economics of long-term care. He has, I think it's, I don't know how many funded research programs, and one of them is going to be presented now. It's, I think it's a joint project with other authors, and I think it's very interesting because it's going to talk about regulation and cost-benefit analysis, and it's going to raise, in my view, many comments and suggestions, and I hope it's going to interest to the audience. What is not interesting to the audience is what I'm telling you, but what he is going to tell to you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Jose, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Pilar and the other members of the organizational board who invited me here to this wonderful conference and this beautiful, beautiful city. I'm looking forward to having tomorrow to look around and go to Alhambra, which I have not seen before, but everyone says I need to go visit. Also, thank you to the translator who will translate from economics to English and then from English to Spanish. Hopefully everyone will be able to understand what I say and get my jokes. Jokes are very hard to translate, so we'll see how this goes. I want to start with a hypothetical question of what would happen if the Spanish government, say, raised taxes on wine by 30 euros per bottle, or banned chocolate, or told people that watching football would cause cancer. Okay, this is terrible, right? Would you be happy? No, of course not. Depending on who you are, more by the wine or the chocolate or the football, but I think everybody would be very unhappy by these three different kinds of regulation of activities that most people enjoy and get pleasure from. So consumption would fall, and utility or happiness or welfare would also be lower. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears, stop scaring you about those things, and talk instead about regulation of smoking. So taxes, if I understand correctly, on cigarettes in Spain are very high. Almost 80% of the final price is some form of taxation in Spain, very high, but typical for Europe, much higher than in the United States. Over the last decade, there have been two different regulations passed that ban smoking, first in public and workplaces, and it's with some exceptions, and then later expanding this to include restaurants and other areas. So now there are bans on smoking. And finally, there are warning labels. Again, this is typical for Europe, fumar mata, or smoking kills, or some other similar warning, smoking is bad for you. So these are three kinds of regulation of smoking of cigarettes that in different ways affect smoking patterns, raising the tax, making it difficult to smoke in certain areas, or providing information about the effect of smoking. So now I want to ask, for smokers, do these regulations make smokers unhappy in the same way that the first slide might have made a broader group of people unhappy? Second of all, do we care? Is smoking somehow different than chocolate or football? Why did the first slide, was considered horrible, and the last slide, okay, the government does all of these very high taxes and bans and so forth on smoking. What makes smoking different? And what is the appropriate economic framework to think about regulating some activity, smoking or otherwise? And especially, one of the things that makes smoking different as an economic good is that it is addictive. It is physically addictive, so that smoking today is related to smoking in the future. Also, smoking is harmful not only to the smoker's health, but to the health of other people through secondhand smoke. Okay, now with that background, I'm going to provide just a little bit of perspective from the United States, not because I want to bore you with institutional detail you don't care about, but this helps motivate the study that I'm working on with two other people, and I think provides the motivation for what I will talk about today. So in 2009, the Food and Drug Administration in the federal government was given the power to regulate cigarettes. And so they very quickly decided, okay, we have the power to regulate cigarettes. We will put a big warning label on cigarettes, a graphic warning label of some sort that will warn people of the terrible things about smoking. Well, the goal, of course, was to inform people about the risks of smoking to their own health and thereby reduce the amount of smoking. Now, in the United States, anytime there is a big piece of legislation, regulation, that may affect a large part of the economy, you can't just propose a regulation, vote on it, and have it implemented. There have to be cost-benefit studies done. And there are enough smokers in the United States that this counted as a big enough economic activity. So they had to figure out what the costs were and the benefits were. Some of the costs and benefits are fairly straightforward. They figured that they could calculate the benefits of smoking to reduced health, secondhand smoking, reduction in that. So they did a number of calculations and figured they could get that part of it. But what is the cost? What are the costs of smoking reduction? That is there a welfare loss from graphic warning labels? Is there a reduction in happiness or utility when people smoke less? Now, one of my appointments at the University of Michigan is in the School of Public Health. And in the School of Public Health, this question is crazy. What do you mean we should think about people's lost utility from smoking if they stop smoking? If I bring this up to someone else in the School of Public Health who's not an economist, you can see their mind just sort of go because they can't comprehend this idea. Why would people get pleasure from smoking, and if that reduces, we should compensate them? So, I mean, this just doesn't make any sense. But we are economists in this room, or people who work with economists, and this is a health economics conference. We're going to think like economists today and try to answer this question and think about how would you value the reduction in smoking from government regulation. So a number of economists over the past several years have weighed in on this particular issue, the FDA graphic warning label proposal, and have tried to calculate the cost of benefits. I should also point out that the tobacco industry, of course, is very much for having a big number for this cost of reduction of smoking, a big welfare loss, because if a lot of people stop smoking, we value that highly, then that's a big cost, and that gets compared to the benefits. Well, it turns out some economists, this may be irrelevant, but they happen to be funded by the smoking industry, have come up with a very, very big number for this welfare loss, roughly equal to the benefits of reduction of smoking. Others have come up with numbers that are much smaller, different assumptions and so forth. I don't want to go through all of those now. There are lawsuits at the moment, it's off the table. But this question will keep coming back. This is not a settled question in any way. And Helen Levy and Jeff Smith and I received a grant from the federal government to address this question. We are really outsiders to the whole smoking literature. That's not our general field. And so we have a grant. We're very grateful to NIH for funding support. And much of what I'm going to talk about today is taken from this working paper. And I hope that in a few weeks this will be an NBER working paper. If you are interested in the details, send me email and I will eventually send you a full copy of the paper. So what I want to do today is think about government regulation and welfare analysis of changes in behavior as a result of that government regulation, and present it in a way that is understandable, hopefully, to everybody here, and to think in particular about how the standard framework may need to be adjusted for something like cigarettes, harmful to health, where there are information issues because of graphic warning labels, and there's addiction. So in particular, we want to be able to answer questions like, what is the welfare loss from taxation? That's fairly straightforward. We're going to start with that. What is the welfare loss from a ban? What is the welfare loss from a warning label? And how does the answer depend on things like information and addiction? So I think this is a kind of policy question where economists really have a lot to offer. This is a question the government cares about, industry cares about, at least in the United States, and I think this affects other countries as well. I think we're in a unique position to address this kind of issue because we think about happiness or welfare or utility, trade-offs between different activities, behavior, taxation. All these things are things we deal with perhaps more than sociologists or epidemiologists. So, having said that, this is still a very tricky problem, and we are well aware that some economists may disagree with our conclusions, but we are working hard to make them clear and airtight, and so we'll see how this goes and what you think of them. So again, in the United States, this question, the answer that people have come up with has ranged from essentially zero, we should care less about if people lose pleasure from smoking, to it's an enormous enormous number. Okay, before we get to smoking with addiction, information problems, and health and so forth, let's start with taxation to make sure we all have the basic framework down. Whenever I have to tackle a very difficult problem, I like to start with something much simpler that I can really understand. So we're going to start with taxation, where there are no information problems, there's no addiction, demand is linear, it's one period model, all of that. We'll relax each of the assumptions as we go along. So think about demand for bread, which I assume is not addictive in Spain, although it's fresh bread, unlike what we get in the US, is much better. So maybe it is addictive, but let's assume it's not. Demand decreases with price. So if price goes up, demand goes down. We're not going to worry about the supply curve. Just think of a very flat supply curve, very competitive market of producing bread. And the utility or happiness that someone gets from consuming bread is the difference between what you are willing to pay and what you actually pay. And I'll have a graph in a second. So when people buy bread, maybe you're willing to pay 2 euros for good bread, but you only have to pay 1 euro, then you get 1 euro of happiness from that. And graphically, we can see that as a triangle where this is the downward sloping demand curve. So when price is very high, we have very, very little quantity consumed. Quantity is on the x-axis. When price is low, we get a lot more consumed. And this will be the supply curve here. This is the equilibrium. So this is the amount actually consumed. PR, this sort of teal color, is the producer revenue, how much the suppliers get in terms of total revenue, quantity times price. And this area up here is a graphical representation of the amount of utility or welfare that people get from consuming demand. Okay, so that's standard economic framework. The question is what happens when we tax this, and we're going to think of a per unit tax, per loaf tax on bread. Demand will fall a little bit because from the consumer's point of view, the price has gone up. Suppliers will get less because from their point of view, demand is falling. And therefore, what's going to happen is that some of this triangular area is going to disappear. And so what happens to it? Well, some of it is still up here. Instead of consuming this amount out here, demand has fallen to Q sub tax. So this is the amount actually consumed. This pink area is the amount of tax revenue that the government gets. It's the product of the amount of tax times the quantity. There's still a lot of consumer surplus utility, but it's gone down because people are consuming less bread. And what we've lost here, if you compare these two graphs, is the yellow area called welfare loss. And so in economics of taxation, this is a completely standard result. I've done nothing new and different so far. But this welfare law, it's like, boom, it's gone. There's utility that's just sort of disappeared. Suddenly the world is a little less happy. I should point out that the tax revenue, although nobody likes paying taxes, economists see that as a transfer from people to government, which would then be used for something else. So what we really care about here is this triangular welfare loss with taxation. So with taxation, we have lower consumption. Some of the consumer surplus is now transferred to the government. Some just disappears. And overall, the world is a less happy place. Okay? And we can quantify that amount by that little triangle. All right. Also, if the demand curve is much steeper, the area, the welfare loss is typically very small. If the demand curve is very flat, the welfare loss will be much bigger. So this is an argument to tax inelastic goods. Okay. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and think about one of the reasons that people give for taxing cigarettes or alcohol or other things like that is that, well, we should tax these goods because the government will then collect the money and then use the money to help pay for health care later, because these activities increase healthcare costs in the future. So it's implicit, the argument is then implicitly we are taxing this good because people don't fully understand the health ramifications of their behavior, and therefore we should tax it explicitly because the tax will somehow represent the health costs per pack. So let's think about that for a minute. So if you have an uninformed person who does not understand that cigarettes actually harm their health, then if you put the exact right size tax on this, where the tax is equal to the per pack healthcare costs, discounted future healthcare costs, then the person will internalize the healthcare costs that they are imposing on society and on themselves. And so even if you have a completely clueless person who does not understand, through the tax you can make them behave as if they actually know this. Okay, so is there still a welfare loss? We're now using taxation for a very specific goal. If the tax properly accounts for the health gain, there's now a net gain. The health gain is that people's health will improve by the amount of the tax, which is equal, it's the amount of money equal to the health improvement times the change in demand. So there's going to be an improvement in health. But the net gain in welfare is then going to be, I couldn't quite get all the colors on here, so let me go through this. This dark green area, HG, represents the health improvement compared with before. People are smoking less. The difference between Q naught and Q tax. How do we value that change in smoking in terms of health? We'll multiply by the tax, and that gets the health gain. There's still a welfare loss from reduction in happiness of smoking, though, so the overall net gain is now this green rectangle minus the yellow triangle that's hiding underneath that you can't see. But if you think about this as a tax for the purpose of improving health, now we have a net gain, and taxation is no longer a net loss. Okay, that's taxation. I want to move on now to thinking about information, because again, at least in the United States, the relevant policy question is not about taxation, and our taxes are much lower than in Europe, but about information, warning labels, and how people respond to those warning labels. With information and making arguments about information, we no longer have a single demand curve. We're now going to have to think about two different demand curves, at least. The simple version has two. The initial demand curve, the uninformed person, the person who does not understand the healthcare costs, the person who says, really, smoking harms my health? Huh? I didn't know that. And we're going to use this curve to look at behavior and, for given price, how much people smoke. And then we're going to keep track of a different demand curve, which we'll call the fully informed person, the one who truly understands that smoking is harmful to health, and so forth. And by the way, if you somehow believe that, gee, if you were fully informed you would never smoke, you should come to the University of Michigan and stand outside the hospital and look at all the nurses who are smoking because of their stressful jobs. So it's not always information that drives smoking to zero. It may affect the quantity they smoke, but there's more to smoking than that. Okay, so now we're going to have two demand curves. And partly this builds from a long literature in the environmental economics literature, which I'm not going to talk about except for this one slide, where they talk about these differences between the two demand curves as being explained by inconsistencies in something like present bias, that is not really caring about the future, or having imperfect information. For example, and this can be used to justify regulation. For example, light bulbs. The old style incandescent light bulb, which has been around in the United States for 100 years or something, is now, you can't buy them anymore. They're gone. You can only buy fluorescent bulbs of various types, and the government worked very hard to provide information, but also tax and subsidize, and then finally ban the old incandescent bulbs because of energy concerns. Okay, let's go back to smoking and revisit this, the tax on cigarettes, and keep analyzing this fairly simple problem. So we still have a tax, and we're now going to think about an uninformed person and an informed person. If we take the perspective now of the informed person, we now have a very different view of the world. So an informed person would look at the initial situation. So people are smoking Q naught. This is the original situation. People are smoking this much because the behavior is based on being uninformed. But if everybody has becomes informed about the bad effects of smoking, then actually this would be their demand curve. If you know about the health costs of smoking, your demand curve shifts down by exactly the tax, given the assumptions. And so the amount of consumer surplus is lower as before. There's no tax now paid to the government. This is all information. And we have negative utility for some people who kind of like smoking a tiny bit, but not nearly enough to pay the price here. So actually you have a welfare loss among fully informed people. If we then, instead of informing people, now we have a tax, and look from this old situation from the perspective of the informed person, we get the following situation. We get the consumer surplus triangle up here as before. We get the tax revenues, actually the rectangle here. And now there's a little welfare loss from the point of view of the informed person, because they're paying all this tax revenue. Taxing is now inefficient if you're informed, because if you understand the healthcare costs, you shouldn't be paying taxes to get there. Taxation is an inefficient way of getting people to do something if the whole point is information. So taxation, we can show, is inefficient. It may be better actually to just provide information. Also, I'll point out that trying to argue that you can have a tax that is exactly equal to the per pack cost, healthcare costs, is actually a very difficult thing. And it also is kind of logically inconsistent, because if you take this perspective about the tax and healthcare costs literally, then you would say, well, actually anyone who fully understands the healthcare costs should not have to pay the tax. And so that's kind of a problem. And this points out one of the fundamental differences between taxation and warning labels. Everyone pays taxes if you buy a pack of cigarettes. Everyone pays taxes. Whether you're informed, uninformed, young, old, doesn't matter, you pay the tax. Whereas the information that's added is people process that in different ways. And someone who already knows about this and the health costs of smoking won't be affected by it because they already know. So applying a tax in this situation may be inefficient. Okay. So again, taxation affects everyone who buys a pack of cigarettes. Bans operate in a slightly different way. It basically sends everyone to zero consumption. So those who smoke a lot are affected far more than the occasional smoker, and also may force people to change locations. And the information label, which is really the topic that we're interested in, depends on information and what people already knew. So the amount of how people respond to the information depends on whether they knew about this before or not. Okay, so let's think about warning labels and information, and then we'll add in addiction as well. Okay. Also, to reiterate, to make it very clear what our task is, we're assuming that the government can already calculate the benefits of smoking, and we just care about the utility loss for the smoker. We're only looking at the internalities, the effect of smoking on the smoker, not secondhand smoking. It is believed that that is well known and documented. So secondhand smoking, secondhand exposure is very important. It's not what we're looking at. Okay. So we're going to assume now that a warning label provides information. Ideally, the perfect label would be accurate. It would have information about health risks, the health cost, mortality effects, would be specific to the person, and would also, and I don't think this comes up nearly enough, discusses the difficulty of quitting. One of the things that is sort of a cognitive dissonance in this whole literature is that many young people, at least in the United States, are pretty well aware that smoking causes health problems, but they say, well, I'm 16, I'll start smoking a little because I can quit. When I get to be 20, or when I have kids, or when I get older, then I'll quit. I'll just smoke a little bit now. They don't realize how incredibly hard it is to quit, how addictive smoking is. And so I actually think that although the argument is usually about health risks, it's really the cost of quitting, the challenges of quitting, that is perhaps where the biggest information problem is. Okay, so we assume that this information, this label, is accurate and has this information, and that people actually read the labels, understand them, trust them, and act upon that information. Now, I don't know about Spain, but in the United States, when the government says something, there's a certain fraction of the population that instantly believes the opposite because of complete distrust of the federal government. So that is actually an important issue here. Lots of conspiracy theories about all sorts of crazy things. So anyway, if a warning label is going to be effective, it should say something about this will be harmful to your health in the following ways. It will be very difficult to quit, and you should believe this label. And then people should act on that. So again, the big difference from taxation is some people already know this, some people do not, whereas anyone who buys cigarettes will pay the same tax whether you're informed or not. And so some people will know about the health risks and the quitting costs. Some people, if it's a really informative label, won't understand it. Most people don't understand even basic statistics and probabilities. And some people probably won't believe it or even act on it. So ideally, a good warning label would shift the demand curve down, at least for some people. And so let's now hypothetically assume that we have a really good warning label that will shift the demand curve in the appropriate way, and think about what is now the welfare gain or loss. And again, we're going to always want to think about an informed person and an uninformed person, and we argue that we should take the perspective of the informed person and use the informed person's demand curve to calculate welfare loss and utility changes, not the perspective of the uninformed person. Okay. So here's a situation. The top demand curve is exactly the same as we've had before, and the bottom one, DI, is now the informed demand curve. And in the middle, we're going to put DL for delabel. That is the demand curve that one gets if you provide a label, which may not be entirely persuasive or informative. It may be a little bit persuasive. So it'll shift demand a little, but not all the way to where we want it to be. And in this case, what we'll get is a shift. So initially, we have this relatively big welfare loss triangle that we've talked about before. And then if demand shifts over a little bit to the dashed line, then this triangle will get smaller, and that would be an improvement, less welfare loss relative to the point of view of the informed person. Okay, so that's the simple part about, or I should say, warning labels from this perspective are actually quite simple. Well, maybe. We haven't talked about addiction, though. And addiction, again, is one of the things that makes cigarettes very different than anything else. And that's kind of the first thing that ever comes up, and is, oh, cigarettes are totally different, they're addictive, that changes everything. So let's think about addiction now. Let's add addiction to the equation. Nicotine, one of the substances in cigarettes, is addictive. And so we want to think about how that affects welfare analysis. In economics, the seminal article about addiction and smoking and other addictive behaviors goes back to Becker and Murphy in a paper called Rational Addiction. And to them, addiction was defined by having something called adjacent complementarities. I don't know how that translates. It's a terrible phrase in English, though. But what it really means is that by smoking now, that will affect the marginal utility of future smoking. So by smoking now, it'll affect how much I enjoy smoking in the future by building up a stock of smoking. Initially, smoking is kind of difficult. I don't quite my body doesn't adjust to it, but then over time, my body adjusts in a way that the marginal utility gets greater the more I smoke now. Therefore, the amount I smoke now affects how much I smoke in the future. They also talk about prices, they talk about quitting cold turkey, they talk about a number of things that they say their model can explain. But there are no information problems in their model. This is about, they're both from the University of Chicago, and where all people are rational, and they wanted to come up with a model where this kind of made sense. Again, in the public health world, just the title rational addiction is problematic. So in their model, Becker and Murphy model, there are no irrational decisions. People like to smoke, they make the decision to smoke, may smoke for a while, eventually quit. It's all very utility maximizing and happy in a way. And so in this framework, if this is how you view addiction, warning labels are very easy. People make decisions based on the information they have. If new information comes out, they re-optimize. It's really not a big problem. And it really doesn't change welfare analysis from their point of view. And they would say you should always take the point of view, again, of the informed person who has full information. Okay, but Becker and Murphy is not the last article on rational addiction or addiction and smoking by any means. One of the reasons their article is important is it inspired other people to think very critically about addiction and what it means and behavior around smoking, and to think more seriously about what it is that smokers do that affects their behavior of starting and stopping, and how much and how prices affect things. So I'm going to briefly go through 4 different models of what it means to be addictive, and each of them think again about information. So one of the follow-on papers sort of redefined how we think about addiction into thinking that there are basically two different types of people. There are those who are easily addicted, physically easily addicted, and those who are really not, and people learn through experience. They'll smoke a few cigarettes, and then some people will realize too late, oh my goodness, I'm one of those people who's easily addicted, and now I'm addicted and it's too late. Others will figure out early, oh, I think I'm going to have a problem, so I'm going to stop smoking before I become addicted. And a paper by Orphanides and Zervos. And again, this is a case where the government can provide information about the probability of health consequences and quitting and so forth, and that government information is always welfare enhancing. That is, if there are changes in smoking behavior due to providing information, that's good, and we don't see this. If you take the perspective of the more informed person, then again, there's no welfare loss from a reduction in smoking due to more information. Paper by Saranovich, Goldfarb, and Leonard looked more critically at the quitting costs, thinking about how actually quitting is really challenging. And there are a lot of people who are currently smokers. They would have higher utility if they were instantly a non-smoker. But getting from smoking to non-smoking is really hard, and paying that cost is too much. It's just easier to keep smoking a little bit and being a little unhappy than to have to actually quit, which is a very challenging thing. They argue, again, the government regulations would be preferred by a person's alter ego, their more informed self, by preventing people from starting to smoke early on. Okay, well, what if you think that the reason people smoke has to do with discounting the future? One of the things that economists like to talk about is the discount factor. How much do you care about the future versus the present? If I say I'll give you 100 euros today, or 200 euros a year from now, which would you rather have? If I say 100 euros now or 100 euros in the future, you always take 100 euros now. But if I make it big enough, you'll want it in the future. That's a way of quantifying how much people care about the future compared to the present. And it turns out that if you assume a constant discount factor, there are a lot of behaviors that are not well explained. But if you assume what's called a hyperbolic discount, that is a very high discount from today to tomorrow, and then a smaller discount factor after that, a lot of behaviors seem to be fairly well explained. That is, there are a lot of people who will say something like, I will quit smoking tomorrow. Not today, but I'll quit tomorrow. Tomorrow comes, but when tomorrow becomes today, then tomorrow is another day in the future, and they will still quit tomorrow, okay? Or the same with exercise. I'm going to start exercising tomorrow. I will tomorrow, but not today. And this, or change my diet, or other things. This may be able to be explained by hyperbolic discounting. And so one of the arguments is, well, maybe smokers really discount the future. And then you have a tension, it turns out, between your current self and your future self. And Gruber and Kaseji have a pair of articles that argue that this difference between current and future selves leads to the argument that governments should have much higher taxation or other forms of regulation that reduce smoking. Your future self will be much happier if you really quit today. And so if the government can help you do that, you'll be better off if you're a smoker. Okay. And finally, paper by Bernheim and Rangel talking about cue triggers. And one of the reasons this is a really interesting paper is they actually rely heavily on psychology and the psychology literature to make arguments, and they got a paper in the AER, and it's one of the few times when very serious economists kind of look outside of our narrow walls and actually consider what other social scientists are doing. So kudos to them for doing that. They also have gobs of math, so if you're math phobic, not a good article. But their point here is that people will, they argue that people have, again, two forms of themselves: the sort of rational, cold, calculating utility, maximizing person, and then someone who will be triggered by environmental cues. For example, you go to a conference, people start dinner late, the wine is good, the food is good, the company is fabulous, and you end up staying out very late at night doing all sorts of things because of the environment that you find yourself in. And then, of course, other people will find themselves in an environment where you end up doing drugs or dangerous behaviors or really bad things. But it's these environmental cues that lead people to make what they call irrational decisions. But again, in that case, they would argue that to the extent the government regulates in a way that changes behavior that is good from the cold, rational point of view, that is good, and that is the perspective you should take for welfare analysis. So collectively, all of these papers about addiction, about rational addiction, argue that welfare analysis should be done for the either fully informed person or the future person or the cold rational person. And therefore, any sort of correct information that changes behavior is welfare improving because you take the perspective of that fully informed person. Okay, now I want to touch on a few other small things before wrapping up. So first of all, when I started to talk about information, I said, well, let's assume that the information is easy to understand, it's accurate, believed, and so forth. What if the information's wrong? Okay? What if the warning label is misleading or is actually too strong? So, you know, smoking will kill you and all your loved ones instantly, just some sort of completely overblown exaggeration. And let's say people believe it. They will actually reduce smoking too much. Again, a concept that my public health friends do not understand. But it is possible to reduce smoking below the correct, fully informed levels. Also, there would be issues about credibility of future messages from the government. So information is great if it's really accurate and people believe it, but it is possible actually to have a situation where the demand curve from the label is actually shifted too far to the left because people respond too much. And then you actually end up I didn't put it here because it was hard to figure out how to draw all the triangles, but you end up with a much smaller consumer surplus than you sort of should based on the DI triangle. So you end up with actually too little smoking, if you can understand that. So warning labels can be good if they are accurate and believed. Let me finally dispense with two other fairly small points, and this is a fairly subtle thing. In economics, you'll know that basically always we draw demand curves and supply curves with perfectly straight lines, like this, okay? Do we really believe that demand curves have perfectly straight lines? Of course not. This is done because it's easy to graph in the program that I have. It's easy for teachers to do. It's easy for textbooks to draw. That's why we draw linear demands. If you go through the trouble as I did to figure out how these triangles change in size and shape if you assume constant elasticity demands, because all the empirical work uses logs and therefore constant elasticity. It turns out that the size of the triangles and the welfare loss that my economics colleagues were calculating is overblown by about 1/3. So the size of the reduction in smoking is off by about 1/3 if you assume standard elasticity of about -0.2 for smoking. So that's a small I just wanted to point out that demand curves are probably not really straight, and if they're constant elasticity, which is probably a lot closer to the truth, that actually changes the calculation by a fair amount. Finally, again, because of simplicity, we usually draw graphs and make models for one period. You have one person, one time, one period making a simple decision, where obviously smoking is really a lifetime set of decisions where some people say no, some people start and then quit. Some people attempt quitting many times. It is a long-run process for many people. And so these issues about the welfare effects is not about a single period or a single pack of cigarettes. You would need to sum this over many periods and many times. Fortunately, with constant discount rates, all of this basically reduces down to a single period, so that is good. And so for most of the models that people think about, the lifetime model and lifetime utility and changes in how we think about that really is the same as a repeated static game. The time that does not work is if you don't have constant discount rates, and then consumption in the future consumption does depend on past consumption in a complicated way, and that ends up being a problem. Okay, concluding slides here. First of all, the question that our government in the United States raised about figuring out the welfare loss from reduction in smoking, we think is a very legitimate question to ask. And not an easy one to answer, but a very legitimate one to ask, and we should try and figure that out. We argue, and I think the literature is entirely consistent on this, that the welfare analysis, whatever is done, should be done from the perspective of the fully informed person or some other long-run rational version of fully informed person about the risks of smoking, not from the perspective of an uninformed person. Then if the warning label is true and informative and believed and so forth, then warning labels are fine, and basically what you would get in any situation is that any reduction in smoking is actually going to be welfare enhancing, and we do not therefore take the perspective of the cigarette industry that is a cost. If it's moving people towards what they would do if they were better informed, then that is good. We do also want to point out, though, that not all warning labels are created equal, and some warning labels actually could be harmful if they were over-exaggerating the truth. So again, I think this is an area where economists have a lot to contribute to actual public policy. We think that our framework, pulling together some different literatures and looking at addiction and so forth, will be helpful not only for smoking, drinking, but looking at a wide variety of government regulations. And so we are very excited about this. I'll be presenting a shorter form of this at the IHEA conference in Milan next month, if any of you will be there. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll be glad to attempt to answer questions now. Thank you.
Many thanks, Edwards, for this very complete and interesting conference. Now it's time to questions, suggestions, comments. But before, por alusiones, I'll answer one thing, which is in Spain, when the government says something, now almost everybody believes the contrary.
Oh,
So-
believes the contrary. Okay.
So it's-
There's probably about a third of the United States that
No,
is like
here
that.
is something like 90%.
90%. Wow.
So now some comment, please.
So the government here should say, hey, smoking's good, right?
He's not saying anything about this.
Not symmetric, okay.
Okay, some comment from the audience. Laura.
Laura Vallejo from University of La Laguna.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, I appreciate you said that secondhand smoking is a very important thing, but it's not what you're looking at. But I wonder what will be the conclusions from the welfare, or from a broader welfare point of view, if you have taken secondhand smoking into account.
Right. So secondhand smoking is easier for a couple reasons. I think everyone would agree that secondhand smoking causes health problems in other people, not in the smoker. And those are actually relatively easy to quantify. And it's very clear that if a smoker stops smoking, there is less secondhand smoke, and we're done. The non-smoker does not get pleasure from smoking by the other person. So all of these issues about the demand curve and consumer stuff, that doesn't apply to them. So the only issue for the secondhand smoke is their health problems. So it's a much simpler problem, and it's one that the government has been able to use studies, and that's not where the argument is. And again, it's because the non-smoker, the other person, is not getting pleasure from the smoking. So when the smoking stops, there's no reduction in pleasure or utility.
David? No. Could you say who you are? And
Hello,
hi.
I'm Silvana Robone from University of Insubria. I just wanted to make some comment that I think that maybe this policy of warning labels can be particularly effective if several circumstances and several effects are reported on the cigarette packs. For instance, well, in Italy there are cigarette packs where not just the risk of having cancer or stuff, but other health consequences are reported, and sometimes they are more trivial, but can be considered as well. Like it can reduce your level of fertility, or it can also harm your skin. It can age your skin, smoking. And I think that sometimes people, they tend, if you think about, for instance, cancer, and you're a smoker, you say, okay, I'm a smoker, but probably I wouldn't get it. Or it is, you perceive it as a very unlikely event. But there are, and maybe you can, I mean, maybe if you are in your early 20s, you can be more concerned about the damage to your skin or not to be fertile, and then the probability of getting cancer. So I think that either in this way, a kind of diversification of what is reported on the labels can be a useful policy tool, a useful policy element to make these kind of policies more effective. Because maybe the consequence of smoking that can be the most relevant to one person is not the most relevant to another one. Yeah.
That's a very good point. And I think I would just add to that the challenge for an accurate label is how do you convey that information in a way, not just, well, you may get skin cancer or lung cancer or have fertility problems. If the government goes to the point of saying it changes your probability, that may be accurate, but it's very hard for people to understand. And I think that's why the US government was hoping to go to graphic warning labels with photographs of a diseased lung or skin or other problems, because that is a more visceral reaction that will be stronger. I agree with you that not doing something more specific than just, gee, it'll be bad for your health, but providing a range of warnings, different warnings on different packages, talking about the different problems is probably the best way to go. Yeah.
Please. Now it's David.
Thank you. Taking up the point about who is a decision maker, and we have the consumer, but perhaps the policy perspective, as you say, should be from the rational side of the consumer, let's say.
Yeah.
What about the government? What view should we take about the government's interests and sort of rationality, let's say, sort of looking perhaps from the public choice kind of perspective? The government's own interests are not necessarily around maximising welfare in a very general way. They have very specific interests. In Spain, I think, perhaps a long time ago, perhaps even now, there are subsidies for tobacco growers. So these kind of things going to influence public policy making.
Yes, that raises a lot of very interesting issues. I used to live in North Carolina, which is south of Washington, D.C., and is right in the middle of a very large tobacco growing country. And so all around where we used to live, there were tobacco farms. I had the opportunity as a young faculty member to go on a trip around the state of North Carolina and visit a number of industries, including tobacco farmers, and hear about their issues that they're facing. Tobacco farmers will tell you they're the most regulated industry in the United States, a title that is contested by every other industry in the United States. You're right, there are subsidies, there are regulations, and part of what, of course, the government is in a way happy to do is to have our tobacco growers grow tobacco and then sell it overseas to countries like Spain, thank you very much. And so it's a complicated political problem. Now, going back to public choice about individuals over the lifetime, there's a wonderful article by Will Manning and others trying to get at the costs of smoking and drinking, and do smokers and drinkers actually pay enough in taxes to compensate for the healthcare loss in the future. And there you get into very difficult issues about what is it that the government should be promoting. Should the government be promoting health, or should it be worried about excuse me, things like pension funds? From the point of view of pension funds, the best thing to happen is for someone to live to age 65 and then drop dead on their 65th birthday, because then they don't collect Social Security and Medicare and all of that, which is a terrible way of looking at the world. So you have to be very careful in taking the government perspective about what it is you're trying to maximize. And I think the correct thing is worrying about maximizing people's health, qualities, or some measure of health. And that, again, I think goes back to being consistent with the individual's informed view of decisions they would make. But a lot of good points.
Elena.
Hello, Elena from Pompeu Fabra University. Considering these ideas of behavioral economics, there is a lot of sensitiveness regarding tobacco with, for instance, the child. So, a smoker, if it's a baby nearby, he just stopped smoking. So I don't know if these warning levels could be a good idea to use this psychological, so to use this fact of externality, because it's, okay, you are not going to be responsible just for your own damage, but for somebody else. So I don't know if in that levels they, for instance, statistics on the people that are suffering from lung cancer that are not being smokers could also affect and enhance these type of effects, because she's somehow blaming the people and making this guilty. And I don't know if whether this could be a good idea or...
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Certainly thinking, having smokers think not only about themselves, but for their other family members and loved ones, and in particular children who really have no choice if they live in a household with smokers. You would hope that the parents would take that into account in their smoking decisions about how much and where. It's not only the secondhand smoke, though. One of the major gateways for young people to start smoking is to steal cigarettes from their parents. At least in the United States, that's true. And so it's not only secondhand smoke, it's parents basically providing cigarettes unwittingly to their children to try. It's all very problematic.
More questions?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm Judith Ball from the Center for Research in Health and Economics at Pompeu Fabra. I was wondering, by the comments and also for your presentation, is there any, by curiosity, is there any empirical work on, for example, the labels? And if so, is it like an established fact, whether it's efficient or not? And if so, for each age group? Because some people have commented here on, you know, the incidence of these labels or the potential effects on differential, are maybe differential by age. And so I was wondering whether you're aware of any empirical study analyzing that. Thanks.
I am not aware of any empirical studies. If anyone does know of any, please let me know. There's a hand over here. Just we'll let you respond in a second. Hopefully you've done the definitive study. Partly in the United States anyway, we don't have a whole lot of variation. We had a Surgeon General's report in 1965. There are a bunch of warning labels. They really haven't changed. There's not a whole lot of variation. So I'm not aware of that. Again, there's the issue of to what extent do people respond to the warning label. And there was a court case some years ago in the 90s in the United States about this very issue of how much is the welfare loss. And so it looked like this was going to go through the courts and get resolved. And then the judge said, this is irrelevant. Nobody pays attention to the warning labels, case dismissed. So the question that we're dealing with here was not answered by the courts because the courts said it's irrelevant for a different reason. Not the original question, but people won't respond, therefore it's not an issue. I would love to hear.
Tony, please. No, wait.
Tony Mora from WIC Barcelona. There were some papers in Asia last year, but this is on the obesity issue. I mean, it's labeling nutritional contents, and there were some examples of labeling in specific areas, counties, and also I think in small municipalities. So there is literature, but on obesity.
Yeah, nutritional labeling I think is very different than warning labels, but okay.
More questions?
And if anyone is too shy to speak up in front of this wonderful audience, I'll be happy to talk with people afterwards also. So.
More questions? I have one, or more. So here, what you have presented, I'm going to take advantage of your skills in econometrics to take the view of applied microeconometrician,
Okay.
like Judith. It's an applied view. So you have presented different models, but these different models can map the same behavior to very different welfare impacts. And in these situations, it becomes very hard to draw conclusions about, say, policies. some policies or many policies, depending. So let's focus on addictive goods, if you like, is tobacco. In terms of welfare, smokers are worse off or better off because of taxes, depending on the model. They are worse off under rational models because of rationality, and they are better off under inconsistent models because of, for instance, self-control. So my difficulty when I'm an applied microeconometrician is that people could be different at different times. People are different because are different people. So it's very difficult. So they could be informed differently because they are different, but they could be informed differently because they have different ages. So it's very difficult. So it's a question here of heterogeneity, which affects to separate spurious and true things. Very difficult. But this also questions about confounding effects or confounding models, because Bacon-Murphy says that these adjacent complementarities, but this is keeping us with the Joneses, or envy, or conspicuous consumption, or whatever. So in these different situations, we know very well the theory, but we don't know anything about the behavior of the people, because we don't have data to know about this. We need data from the very beginning, when he was born, to the very end, when he is dead. So we don't have this data. And then appears another effect which is very difficult to deal with, which is time. Time is very complicated. But my feeling is that in this kind of mare magnum of things, identification not of demand, but of utility, satisfaction, welfare, can be done at changes, which means when you are smokers and quit, or when you quit and restart. Because some surveys provide satisfaction or utility or whatever. And then if you have the same individuals, you avoid many of the problems that we have. To identify not demand, it's satisfaction. Probably you can identify some part of the demand in the continuous part of the distribution of smokers. So I'm very worried because for me, doing this kind of things is really difficult in applied perspective, and I'd like to have yours.
Yes, it is, and for reasons we just talked about, there's really not a lot of data about warning labels, at least none that we all collectively seem to know about. So that's a huge problem. There's a lot more known about taxes, cigarette taxes, and how that affects consumption. But that, you're right, that does not get at the utility, particularly during the process of quitting, right? Which I think is one of your points, is that in the process of quitting, utility may be very negative, and to get from smoking to non-smoking, and then what happens when people start up again, it's a very difficult thing. And as you point out, it will change when people are in stressful environments. It seems like the utility of smoking is higher. And this also changes over time. My understanding is that the body chemistry of teenagers, we all know body chemistry of teenagers doing a lot of different things, but one of the things it does apparently is respond differently to nicotine and what's in cigarettes, and that's why you get a lot of initiation of smoking in the teenage years as opposed to much earlier or later. So utility may be very different in those situations. yes, those are a lot of good points and a lot of challenges, and that's why we have so many good, young, bright health economists in the world to answer these questions for us, right?
Some additional question? Okay. It's the last one.
Thank you then for the last opportunity.
Okay.
I'm Pilar Pinilla from NICE. I'm just wondering, because when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about addiction and dependence to some substance. It came to my mind that fairly recently in the UK it has been approved a treatment for alcohol dependence for reduction of consumption of people who have alcohol dependence. So what will be the impact on such an analysis of this kind of treatment if they will become available, for example, for smoking?
So, tell me the intervention again.
So it's a treatment
Yeah.
that helps reduce consumption in people who have addiction or dependence to alcohol.
How does it reduce consumption?
Well, I didn't do the appraisal for this treatment, so I don't know, but if this kind of treatments help to reduce your addiction, your dependence to the substance that you are addicted to, I guess that will have a big impact on...
Just for alcohol, so I understand, is that something that people consume?
Yeah, it's a
Oh, I
pill.
see. So it reacts to the alcohol in your blood. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me answer in a way that goes back to cigarettes. I think this may be like e-cigarettes, new style of cigarettes which allow people to get nicotine without the many various serious health consequences. And if the cigarette industry can figure out how to get people addicted without killing their consumer population, they will be very happy. And I think that is their golden ATM machine that they're trying to get to, is a way to reduce smoking of harmful cigarettes, but keep other demand. Okay.
Thank you. Edward, thank you for your brilliant talk. Thank you to everybody for comments, for being here. And thank you to the president of the association for allowing me to be here. That's very nice.